Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for showing up today. We're going to have a very exciting talk today by Dr. David Walt Nurtoes, and I'd like to give a really interesting biography and background of him. He's a university professor emeritus in the Department of Population Medicine at the University of Guelph. He was founding president of Veterinarians Without Borders Canada and a founding member of Communities of Practice for Ecosystem Approaches to Health in Canada. He has worked on every continent except Antarctica on ecosystem approaches to health. And in 2010, in London, England, the International Association for Ecology and Health presented him with the inaugural award for contributions to ecosystem approaches to health. In 2019, he received an award from the World Small Animal Veterinary Association, recognizing veterinarians who have exhibited exceptional acts of valor and commitment in the face of adversity to service the community. Beyond peer-reviewed publications, he has authored or co-authored several scholarly books, including titles such as Ecosystem Sustainability and Health, A Practical Approach. He has also published 6 books of poetry, a collection of recipes and dramatic monologues, an award-winning collection of short stories, 2 murder mysteries, and various books of popular science, including a book very relevant for today called On Pandemics, Deadly Diseases from Bubonic Plague to Coronaviruses. So without further ado, I would love to hand off the screen to Dr. Walt Nurtoes for this seminar.
Thank you. And I will try to get try to share something here. Let me do this. Yes. Share that. Does that show up?
That is
yes.
correct.
You can see that? Okay. Yeah, this is, it's one of these things that's hard to get your head around. And I was actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a publisher came to me and asked me to write this book. And I was actually glad for it because, like everybody else, I was completely overwhelmed by, what's the right word? The feces storm of news, daily news cycles and everything going on at the same time, and just daily details, and it's ongoing. And at a certain point, you just, your head begins to explode. And then trying to focus in on how do we begin to make sense of it. And my tendency then is to stand back and say, what's the context here? What's the bigger picture? So this is the title, and I'm living on lands that's a traditional home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and neutral people, that just recognizes that there were a lot of people here before the Europeans arrived. Let's see if I can get this to go. Yes. We tend to think of the pandemic, or a lot of people do, as a bad, primarily a bad thing, which for most people it is, but there are some good things about it as well. So I just want to look at how different ways we can look at the same information. So some of the most frustrating things about this pandemic are it's caused by a zoonotic agent, so an agent that comes from other animals. And historically, we haven't been able to eradicate those. Once they're established in people, things like measles and other diseases, it's much easier to actually find ways to eradicate them. If the agents are living in other animals, it becomes much more problematic. It's shattered, and I've used the word Cartesian here. I'll come back to Rene Descartes later, because it's a way of doing science which has informed most of our great accomplishments in science, but it's also created some constraints. And buried in that way of doing science is the notion that we can predict and control things. And the pandemic is lasting long enough that it's basically destroyed a whole economic system. And I say it's the most successful, and a lot of people have pushed back and say yes, but, and I think we all see the yes, but here. So the positive side of this is that it's caused by a zoonotic agent. We can't eradicate it, but it causes us to, so we're pushed to rethink our relationship with the natural world. How, if we can't eradicate it, what else can we do? It's shattered this notion of predict and control, and so it's forced us to think about how we do science, how we do sciences, I would say that in the plural. And it's lasting long enough to allow us time to reorganize ourselves in perhaps more sustainable ways and address issues that are happening at the same time, which range everything from Black Lives Matter and institutional racism to climate change and a whole range of other things, which are all embedded in the system which allowed this pandemic to emerge and spread. I'm going to give a quick review just of zoonoses and diseases from other animals. And technically, there are differences between zoonoses and diseases we get from other animals. Zoonoses are a subset of that. I tend not to be that picky, but it's worth looking at what's meant by this. So we share diseases with livestock, with wildlife. There are diseases in humans that are spread just with each other. And I'm not going to go into detail on this, but anybody that gets into this field, I mean, the traditional zoonotic disease is rabies. That's one that
I would have thought it would occur.
Plague. If you get into foodborne diseases, Salmonella, E. coli. If you get into wildlife, maybe Lyme disease, hantavirus, pulmonary syndrome, Ebola virus, and the first SARS. So we have all of these overlaps. Traditionally, and in fact, when I was teaching it, I mostly focused on what are the species from which we get different agents. So what can we get from chickens? What can we get from pigs? What can we get from dogs, from specific kinds of wildlife? In terms of thinking about how this pandemic in particular has emerged, I think it's pushing us more to look at not just the specific animals, but the context. So if we look at how they're spread, we can look at them by how they're transmitted. Okay, so we have we bite them, which is to say foodborne diseases. We're eating the animals, or they bite us. And the traditional one there is rabies, and one could expand that out to look at other ones. We share an environment, and the upper, I guess it's upper left-hand corner, there you see dogs running around and animals being slaughtered. I spent about 10 years working with people in Kathmandu on Hydata disease. So it had to do with dogs running around, with slaughtering places, contamination of the environment. And we tend to think of environmental contamination in those terms, but if you look at the right-hand corner, you have a dog in I think it was an ICU, which is questionable place to be. But then we also have dogs in homes and so on. We have various ways of sharing environments with animals. If we expand out a little bit, we look at arthropod-borne diseases, and I just have a few examples here. West Nile virus, Lyme disease, bubonic plague. I won't go into detail, but you can see that as we expand out, as soon as you have arthropods, like Lyme disease, like West Nile virus, we begin to look at a whole set of relationships among different species, including the arthropods, and that relates then, the arthropods in the environment has to do with a lot of it has to do with temperature. When we did studies on the northern movement of Lyme disease in Canada, when it started coming in through Long Point and Point Pelee, the southern part of Canada, from adventitious ticks, it was almost entirely temperature related, the movement north. So once it was there, the ticks survived through temperature. So then we've got climate and temperature and land use changes, those kinds of things, all begin to be tied up together. And then, of course, I mean, this is Hieronymus Bosch. It's a bit of a, this is human population, right? We have human to human translation. We have it transmitted between people. And to be a zoonotic agent, it's got to be transmitted technically. If you look historically, we talk about zoonoses as being diseases that we get from animals on a repeated basis. So you have to be exposed to a rabid animal, or you have to be exposed to ticks that are carrying Lyme disease or mosquitoes that are carrying West Nile virus. We tend not to transmit it person to person. Once it gets into human populations, although almost all of the diseases that we care about are of animal origin, we don't, once they become transmissible among people, like SARS-CoV-2, it's not technically a zoonosis anymore. Then it's just, I shouldn't say just, it's a human disease. But if we look at the long run, that differentiation is useful in some control programs, but if we want to restructure things to prevent future diseases from getting into the human population, then looking at the broader context of our relationship with animals becomes important. And over the past decades that I've been involved in some of this work, there have been different ways of trying to integrate. How do we bring together human health, animal health, and what used to be called ecosystem health or ecohealth? In the Great Lakes Basin, ecological integrity was used for the development of programs of the northern US states and the Canadian provinces that are next to the Great Lakes to look at management of the Great Lakes Basin. So they talked about ecological integrity of the Great Lakes Basin, and that involved human health, animal health, environmental issues, all of those kinds of things. There was a movement out of Tufts, I think it was initially conservation medicine, which eventually actually many of the people involved in that went on to start the Ecohealth movement, the one that Peter Daszak and those people are involved in now, the International Society for Ecosystem Approaches to Health, those kinds of things. If you look at some other organizations, the UNDP, the development program, talked about sustainable livelihoods. So a lot of people in development work talked about sustainable livelihoods. The focus was on people, but it was the same kind of, how do we integrate these things? And then most recently, the catchword has been One Health. I'm not going to go into the differences between these different approaches. There's a lot of politics involved. There are shifts in emphasis. There are shifts in whether they're bottom up or top down. And those differences are important, but they're not critical to trying to get our heads around how do we integrate this. I don't think that there's one right approach. One of the things that if you're involved in One Health, let's use that as the model right now, is that when we take these systemic approaches, they often default to fixed boundaries. So as vets, we look at the health of an animal, the health of a farm. I was involved for about a decade on agro-ecosystems in Canada and in Kenya and other places, so looking at agricultural boundaries. One of the things that this pandemic or any pandemic raises is that those boundaries are shown to be very leaky or very, I mean, we're all very leaky, but then we have all this cross-boundary activity. And I know that there were ecologists who argued for a long time that ecosystems didn't exist. I think Tillman was one of the people that argued that it was just competition of different species on a landscape. I guess I'm somewhere in the middle. There are different ways of looking at these interactions, but certainly in a pandemic, those boundaries create problems because it's the disease doesn't stay in the one place where it emerged. Another way to look at this, and one that I've used a few times, is the use of narrative. So looking at historical developments over time, and those, you can change the boundaries on those. It's not that one's right and one's wrong, but there are different ways of looking at how do these things unfold over time. So for instance, is this pandemic a story about viruses, people, and technology? We've seen this, one of the stories that has come out is that it has to do with human viral interactions and our work on viruses in laboratories, for instance, gain-of-function studies, leaks into the environment, this very controversial notion that the WHO team with Peter Daszak and others tried to look at is, could it have come out of a laboratory? So that the story is really one of people and viruses and what we do with viruses. Another story, and these aren't mutually exclusive, they're different ways of looking at it. Is it a story about bats and pangolins or raccoon dogs or snakes or cane rats and people? And if you look at some of the various studies that have been reported, they say, well, the virus is a little bit like something we found in pangolins or raccoon dogs or snakes or cane rats. How do these things relate to each other? This is another way of talking about the pandemic. It's a narrative, it's systemic, but it's also over time. And is it a story about wet markets and our desire for fresh food? And I'm differentiating here a little bit from wet markets and wildlife markets. In Southeast Asia, where I've done some work, and in China, you will have fresh food markets. We all want fresh food. We've been sold on the idea it's got to be fresh or it's not worth eating. So these have fresh food markets essentially. And farmers will bring in, for instance, chickens. They don't have refrigeration. So if they bring in a dead chicken, what do they do with it at the end of the day if they don't have refrigeration? So they often will bring them in live. In this case, the picture you're seeing here is in Cambodia, and they've preserved them in these pigs in different ways. But we have this dynamic, and then there are the wildlife markets, which are a subset of that. Sometimes they're quasi-legal, sometimes they're black market, but I think there's a tendency to lump together wet markets, fresh food, and wildlife, and I think that's a problem because we all want to have fresh food and we go to farmers markets and that kind of thing. So trying to differentiate there. And then there's another kind of story which intrigued me, and that it initially began because I saw reports that at the beginning of 2018 there were explosive outbreaks of African swine fever across China, and we could go back. African swine fever actually emerged out of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, Eritrea, killed off a lot of animals there, and actually it was related to the Italian invasion of Eritrea and Ethiopia. We won't go back that far, but with regard to this particular pandemic, it spread across China, and 2018, 2019, about 200 million pigs in China died either directly from African swine fever or from trying to stamp it out, because there was no other way to deal with this. So we've lost half the swine population in China. And the timing of this is interesting, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So that 2018, 2019, we have this thing this disease which human epidemiologists were not paying attention to. I mean, who cares about African swine fever, right? It kills pigs. It doesn't do anything to people. Let me go back here and look at how we developed our food system. So we have these different narratives coming together, if you want. Henry IV of France, about 1600, if God keeps me, I will make sure that no peasant in my realm will lack the means to have a chicken in the pot on Sunday. Well, God didn't keep him. He was assassinated by a fanatic Catholic, but nevertheless, that idea carried on. And about the same time, a little bit later, we have this Cartesian idea of science. So he said that by scientific principles, I perceived it to be possible to render ourselves lords and possessors of nature. And his philosophy of science was, forget the textbooks, go out and look at the real world. Focus, look at this, and if we can divide things up into little pieces, we can understand the whole thing. We'll put it all back together again. And there are some real strengths in that, and there are some real problems. Some of the strengths have come from, for instance, our food system. So we've seen since the 1970s and 80s, we wanted food, we got lots of food. And a lot of this was post-World War II. For instance, with chickens, we learned how to synthesize vitamin D so we could put them inside. We could have mass production, change them genetically. The created animals that thrive under certain kinds of conditions with certain kinds of feed. And this was by focusing in on specific feed ingredients, on vitamins, on light, on genetics, and those kinds of things. So we went from a farm system not that long ago, where before we could have the farmer, the butcher, and the animal rights activist all in the same picture, as you see in the top over here, to a situation now where the animal rights activist isn't going to be there. Arguably, is this a farmer or not, or is it just a big livestock business, right? So essentially, you've got this livestock business, so you've got slaughtering on the outside, you've got animal welfare issues on the outside. And it's less transparent, if you want, so people don't know where their food comes from. The other thing that's happened, and this is a bit of an aside here, is that we went from about 8.5 million tons of excrement production in the 1960s to about 14 billion tons, so million tons of excrement production, primarily livestock related. And if you see where livestock are concentrated, that's where the feces are, right? So and that's created a whole other set of problems. It's not related to this pandemic, but it is related to environmental issues and those kinds of things. What happened was we had this massive success based on focusing in on very specific variables, if you want, but we have these unexpected outcomes because the world is not this finely tuned linear model. All kinds of things interact in complex ways. And, we think we're playing with the train down here, but there's a real train coming down the tracks, and the real train is the pandemic, of course. And we might be playing with something in the lab over here and not have a clear understanding what's coming down the tracks. If we look at, and this is, you look at this, and it could be a kid's drawing, right? But it's actually a model, a computer simulation model created to look at international food trade networks. And I can give you the reference on this. I looked at that and I thought, boy, my grandkids could make pictures like that. But this is what world trade looks like. Food trade networks look like. Who's trading with whom, stuff going all over the place. A lot of it's invisible to us. We go to the grocery store, we don't see this, we see the end product. The idea was, until 10 years ago, 5 years ago, this was going to generate money for everybody. And it did generate a lot of wealth, and a lot of people got pulled out of poverty, but we also at the same time have this split between the wealthy getting wealthier and the poor getting poorer. So there is more wealth, but we also have this very bad distribution. And if you look at epidemiologic studies, there's a clear association between this kind of differentiation between wealth and poverty and the emergence of diseases. Let's come back now to China. So since the 1990s, we've paid attention to avian influenza. At first it was H5N1, and then it was H9N2 and various other versions, if you want, of avian influenza viruses. And that never became pandemic. It became, if you want, panzootic. It stayed in the poultry population, partly because people jumped on it right away. They said, we can control this, we're going to manage it. We know where it's coming from, at least in an immediate sense. In January and February of 2020, there were outbreaks of avian influenza in Hunan province, so south of Wuhan, where we saw the emergence of SARS-CoV-2. So we've had the drop in the pig population, lost half the pig population. We have problems with avian influenza in chickens and culling of chickens, and then we have the Chinese New Year. So you've got hundreds of millions of people going to the market and trying to get food, often meat, often chicken and pork, to try to get food for celebrating the New Year. So we found, if you want a kind of a perfect storm, a lot of people saw this last year as being devastating. I was born in the year of the rat, so I have sort of a warm feelings toward rats in this sense anyway. And I was amused to see, let's see how this rat year will work out for you when it first came in. So we had this transition between the last year and this year. We had hundreds of millions of people going to market trying to get food. And we have these changes in the supply of meat in the markets. So that's one possibility. People were looking for other sources of meat. I won't complete that story. A lot of these stories, these narratives, have missing information. We just haven't looked for them. Whether we can get it or not is a whole another question. But the point is that there are different ways of explaining what happened than simply the straightforward narrative that we've been given. If it came from bats, we can look at bats are 20 to 25% of all mammal species. So sure, there's a possibility there. We're talking primarily in this case about fruit bats, but how would a virus get from bats into people? And there are different ways. Let's look at some other diseases that have probably come from bats. How did they get into people? If I can get to the next. There we go. The movie Contagion was largely based on a virus called Nipah virus, which emerged in the late 1990s in Malaysia, in an area of a village called Nipah. We had changes in climate, and there was widespread burning of forests in Indonesia and Sumatra and islands adjacent to Malaysia. If you looked at the satellite images, there was smoke over the whole area. At the same time, we had Singapore trying to keep a clean island. They farmed out literally their pig production. They eat a lot of pork, Chinese-based diet uses a lot of pork. And these, interestingly, I mean, the pig farms were in Indonesia and in Malaysia. And the pig farmers, you would think, ecologically, this was good. They had mango trees around the pig farms. But at the same time, you had migrating fruit bats. And the migrating fruit bats, some of them were getting disoriented. Some of them were changing their migrating patterns because of the smoke haze. And they ended up around the pig farms. Bats are messy eaters. The partly eaten mangoes fell into the pig pens. The pigs got sick, and people picked up the virus from there. So one of the ways that a bat virus can get into people is mediated through the way we raise food animals. So there's a kind of and the way we change the environment. So forest clearing, forest fire burning, climate change issues all tied in. And then in an immediate sense, we have the bats moving into areas, maybe new areas, and coming into contact with livestock and people. Another set of viruses that have come from bats are Ebola viruses. And if we look at the history there, we had political violence in Liberia and Republique de Guinea in the 1990s and early 2000s. So people were displaced during the war. And then that was followed by billions of dollars of mining investments over the next decade. And more than half of Liberia's forests were sold off to industrial loggers. So this was to bring in money and create jobs. And that's by itself, it would appear to be a good thing. But that's also massive land use change when people are already displaced. And some people were eating bats, but some people were also in new areas. They had been displaced from their home territory. They were eating bushmeat, perhaps in some areas where they had not been eating bushmeat before. In some cases they had been. So they were exposed to wildlife in different ways because of land use change. So it's similar to what we saw with Nipah virus, but it's a little bit different because here we're having industrial development, post-war, people are displaced. In Malaysia, the people weren't displaced, but the bats were displaced. So those are two possibilities. There are lots of others, but just looking at how can they get from bats to people. If we stand back now in terms of One Health and we look at the stories, and we begin to ask, if we're talking about One Health of what? I mean, we can say it's people, animals, and the environment, but is it all people, all animals, all environments? Or do we focus? We have to get our heads around something. And there's a long history of systems thinking, if you want, in these approaches. But where are the boundaries of the system? Who owns it? If I'm working on a farm, I have some sense the farmer owns this territory, or an agricultural area, there are owners of that. And then whose health are we promoting? Whose story is this? And I have some examples here. On the lower left corner, you see the two guys with their roosters there. I was in Indonesia studying avian influenza in rural areas. And there was one area where there were very high levels of avian influenza. And in the middle of that, there was a village which claimed to have no avian influenza. And so we went in and we said, well, we'll have a look at this. And we ran a workshop and talked to them. And we said, do you have any birds that get sick? And they said, well, yeah, we have some. Well, what happens to them? Well, they get thrown in the river out back, right? So maybe they have avian influenza, maybe they don't. Could we see your chickens? So we went out, and they have competitive singing roosters. I am Polung, they're called. And they're worth $2,000 to $3,000 US each. They would go around to competitions around Southeast Asia and compete. So if you have a bird like that, which is worth at least a full year's income for some of these farmers, and the government comes and says, well, we want to stamp out avian influenza, we'll get rid of the chickens, but we'll pay you market value of the chickens. Well, that's one thing if you're in a commercial chicken operation. It's another thing if you've got competitive singing roosters, which are really valuable genetically. They've been bred over many generations, and they're worth a lot of money. The upper right-hand corner there, again, that was working on avian influenza. That's in Thailand, a place called Ubon Ratchathani. And WHO was trying to get people not to raise or eat backyard chickens, free-running birds. And the rationale was that these were more exposed to the environment. They were more likely to be picking up influenza viruses from wild waterfowl, which is their natural home. But if you went to the market, I asked the woman selling this chicken about prices, and the price of a free-running village chicken was much, much higher on a per weight basis than the price of the commercial chicken. So the economic incentive was all to sell backyard chickens, even as the public health pressure was in the other direction. And we sometimes forget, because we live in a certain area where livestock are valued in certain ways, but we go to other parts of the world and they have other values. And it's not simply a matter of saying, well, you need to do this. It's a matter of this is their culture. They have different dynamics going on there. The upper left-hand corner, I put that in there because I was in a workshop in Argentina, and it was people, we were looking at ecology and health in the Yungas, which is the eastern slopes of the Andes. And so there were people from all the Andean countries who had, where there were people settled on the eastern slope, so not the Pacific slope, but the other side. And so we had physicians, we had veterinarians, we had wildlife specialists, ecologists, indigenous groups. And at one point, there were clearly different ideas about how we think about this. Physicians were looking at, well, if people have clear water, good water, good food to drink, they're not going to impose on wildlife. And so we can focus on that. The wildlife biologists were focusing on, if we need to focus on certain species and preserve those species. The indigenous people were saying, this is a land issue, a land rights issue. If we have control and management of large areas here, we're going to work with the whole habitat. So that was the idea. We're going to preserve habitats. And at some point, the debate got really heated. And one of the indigenous leaders, she was shaking her head. She said, you know, traditionally, when we get to this part in negotiations, we would just kill the other people. And I'm going, okay, this is a research academic workshop, you know, maybe we can back off a little bit. But we did continue on the workshop, but what it told me was, we're not just dealing with theoretical issues here of biodiversity and human health and species. We're dealing with issues that matter to real people in real time in real places. And I think sometimes we forget that. I mean, certainly as an epidemiologist, I can make all these models, but until I talk to people who are raising, you know, competitive roosters, who are looking at land rights in Latin America, or this little girl from Laos who's, you know, that's her village chicken that she's taking care of there. Until we see real people in real places, it becomes this abstract exercise, and I think we're not going to get very far if we stay at that level. The temptation is to this, what I would call the Babel temptation, you know, the Tower of Babel, where everybody wanted to build this one tower that goes up to heaven, which is kind of a sense of there's going to be one way to look at all of this stuff, and we know what the right way is to look at it. And that's where this Cartesian science comes in. This is a photographic collage by a wonderful artist called Julie Holcomb. I can't remember where she is in the US, but it's the Tower of Babel, and it kind of, this is the future, right? Is the urban future, and everything else around the sides is not the future. I have to keep doing this. Trying to get the next slide. Another way to do it is to do the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide approach, whereas you have a Babel fish which translates across different cultures and different species, and I kind of like that. And it's taken me more recently, and I won't talk about that very much here, but to people that are looking at microbiomes and at how bacteria and other microbial populations communicate with each other. If we understood that better, we might have a better chance of finding our way through this. So it's not simply the megafauna that we like to look at, but it's the whole bacterial populations, the viral populations that go with livestock, with wildlife, and so on, with bats, with chickens, with pigs. When I travel around the world, it's not just me, but it's my whole microbiome, and I'm carrying stuff from place to place. What does that do to the ecological dynamic at that level? And so one of the ways through this then, and one of my key sort of messages, if you want, and I got this from Oliver Sacks, who talked about the loss of our peripheral vision. He was talking about himself because he had physically lost his peripheral vision. But I think it's an issue for us culturally. The science we've really been good at is the science of focusing in on things. So we could really fast, we could get the genomic sequence of the virus. We could develop vaccines at warp speed, if you want to put it into political terms, really fast. We're very good at that kind of science. What happens, though, if you focus in like that, is you don't see all of the other consequences in this complex system. So we can increase production of food by doing this and this and this, but we don't look at the broader consequences. We can deal with a vaccine or identifying a virus or a bacterium or a toxin, really good at that really fast, but we're not very good at looking at those relationships, which is an ecological way to look at things. So we've got this tunnel vision. We can't all look at everything all the time. I mean, your head would explode if you try to do it. You can't sort of keep it in there. So how do we get peripheral vision? And this is where we come back to One Health. So to get peripheral vision, we have to collaborate across disciplines, across cultures, across organizations. Unless we do that, we're always going to be blindsided. We can't go back to 19th century science where Louis Pasteur or Darwin or these people were natural philosophers, if you will. They could look at everything, right? There's just too much of everything now, too many things that we know. So I work together with people who do really good lab science, or people that are looking at trade issues or economic issues or social and cultural change, to try to understand, if I see this happening, where might that be coming from? And if I make these changes, what might be the consequences of making those changes? And sometimes, and this is where we come back to this, you know, what we're doing right now, we have some time. In the top two pictures, when I started working in Nepal, that's what the riverbank looked like. There were people getting their drinking water. In the left-hand corner, there's this woman and her kids, and you can see in the background the animals being slaughtered at the riverside. I was working on Hydatid disease, but quite frankly, the people that lived there, they didn't care about Hydatid disease. That was my scientific issue, right? I was zeroing in. I knew how to follow the life cycle, all of this kind of stuff. When you see the right-hand side there, there's a guy probably going to take a poop down at the riverside there. And initially, we described everything that was going on there, looked at the life cycle, and did public education programs, and nothing changed. And it's partly because it was tied to so many other things. People that were doing the animal slaughtering were also generating money in the community. They were providing jobs. So we finally sat down with everybody around the table, the politicians and a couple of neighborhoods, one of which was run by a communist government, the other was by a very conservative government. They were interested in the bottom line issues. How do we have work? How do we have food? How do we have clean water? And within a few years of engaging people at that level, so not just having the scientific information, but having their own local, cultural, and economic understanding of the dynamics of what they would like in their community, we ended up with those bottom pictures. So Hydatid disease more or less disappeared, but it wasn't because of what we knew about Hydatid disease. It was because we paid attention to the total environment that people were living in. So sometimes in order to make the changes, if we want to get rid of this pandemic, we might need to change a whole lot of other things. And to do that, we can't simply say, you know, here, I found this, I've got the answer. It's more like we need to sit down with people in other disciplines and other communities and other cultures and say, how can we negotiate our way through to a more sustainable future, and in a sense, be our own, be each other's peripheral vision. And this comes back to the quote on the left there is from an anthropologist who was studying the use of insects as food. And I did a book called Eat the Beetles, which I was looking at. People were saying if everybody ate insects, it was going to save the world, climate change, all this kind of stuff. And I thought, well, I've heard some of these kinds of solutions before. If we all eat soybeans, it's going to save the world. If we all eat chicken, we're all going to be better off. And plus, I spent most of my professional life as a veterinarian trying to kill insects that were transmitting disease. So to turn around now and say, how can we better keep these insects alive and eat them? Did a bit of a mind shift in my head. And she was looking at the way we were approaching the issue of eating insects. I've eaten lots of different kinds of insects, it's great, but those are all culturally embedded in different ways of doing things. And so to have a One Health approach to whatever it is, eating insects, pandemics, and so on, we need to pay attention to all these different worlds, whether they're defined by our disciplines, by our backgrounds, and so on, and then talk to each other and try to find a way through to a more sustainable future. And at that point, I think, yes, I'll leave it open to questions. So I'll stop the share right there and we're back to a group picture. So I think we have a few minutes left for answering some questions if people want. If not, if I just sort of did a mind thing on you, then anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Walt Nurtoes. That was awesome. And to the group, if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat. I will read them out. Or, you know, if there is silence, you can, you know, turn on your video, unmute yourself and give it a go.
David, to what extent has the closure of the boundary between you and us changed the pattern of any diseases?
You mean between US and Canada?
Yes.
Well, it's changed my ability to visit my grandchildren in Pittsburgh. my daughter's a physician in Pittsburgh, and then so I got grandkids, and plus I've got grandkids in Australia, which is that's even a bigger issue. That's a good question. I mean, what it's done is it's changed the pattern of other respiratory diseases. Basically, influenza this year dropped off the map because people wore masks and keeping distance and so on. What it's done to other diseases, I'm not sure. I mean, there are, trying to think, Canada and the US.
Blue tongue. How about blue tongue? Remember at one time, blue tongue was never in Canada and was very heavy over here.
Yeah, I thought it had snuck up into Canada in the lower Okanagan Valley, although the Canadians always disputed that. I honestly don't know, Barry, at this point.
I asked that question because here in the United States, we're criticized because of the way we've been very liberal in the handling of COVID-19. And I'm always kidding up my Australian friends and German friends and English friends that we'll soon be able to travel to their countries, but they won't ever be able to come to us because they're having problems with controlling COVID-19. They don't have the vaccine.
I'm not sure you'll be able to get into Australia, but anyway. No, and there's, you know, some people get really riled up. I mean, it's been politicized, and the particular political, what can I say, situation in the US hasn't helped in the way things have been framed. Which isn't to say that there weren't some things that were done well. It's just that they were done in such a way that they weren't recognized as being done well simply because of the language around it. I tend to be more forgiving of some of the political issues because we've told politicians they should defer to the science, but then there are 10 different scientists with different say, well, we should have a complete lockdown, or it should be a targeted lockdown, or it should be this. And there are those kinds of trade-offs. And the question is, we really didn't know at the beginning. We have it's easy to go back now and say, well, what we should have done was this. And so I guess I'm more forgiving, and you're right. One of the things that's happening now is that a system like the US tends to be good at fostering entrepreneurial technological responses. So getting vaccines, those kind of things, really good at that. So you get a quick response with something like that. In a system like Canada or Germany or Australia, where we have a public health system which is really good on a day-to-day basis. I'm in a car accident, I've got cancer, whatever. I walk into the hospital, it doesn't cost me anything. I get treatment, you know, there's no problem with that. That sort of a system was good on a day-to-day basis, and it doesn't respond well to emergencies. It can't turn on a dime because it requires this public consensus. And we've seen that in Europe, even more so in Europe. Australia is a special case, and New Zealand, because two things. One is, well, one of the big things is simply their isolation from the rest of the world. They didn't have as much traffic, and there were a few entry points that people could come in through Melbourne or Sydney or Adelaide, and they could stop people there. And when they've had outbreaks, they shut down the borders. I mean, my son's in South Australia, and he said, the police were stopping people at the state border, and some kids were trying to get through to a party in South Australia. They got fined a couple $1,000 and sent home. I mean, they were serious about this. You can do that there, but in North and South America and Europe, where we have so many points of entry, that's impossible to maintain that. The question now is, how do we get out of this situation? I can talk about long-term restructuring, but what's the transition here? And I honestly don't have a clear answer to that. At some point, some combination of vaccination and masking and slowdown. We were speeding up. I mean, you look at the global traffic, and I was part of that, was just huge. I mean, the graphs were all going up and up and up. Our food production was going up and up. The trade was going up. I think we'll need to slow down a little bit. Some people are already closing borders to trade, I think what's more likely to be helpful is just being more cautious and looking at quality control. I mean, in the 1990s, everybody was promoting trade with China, and so everybody was going to China. We all wanted to trade with China. And then suddenly, you know, you want to stop. I think maybe stopping is the wrong way, but it's a good time to put on the brakes and say, let's look at where things are coming from. Let's look at quality control. Let's look at environmental issues, public health issues, and maintain trade, but at a more measured pace. Maintain travel, but at a more measured pace. And people get upset about wearing masks, but I mean, I've worked enough in Southeast Asia. People have been wearing masks for decades earlier because of air pollution, not because they were worried about a virus. And it's no big deal. You know, taxi drivers in Tokyo were wearing white gloves and wearing masks. Just what people did. To me, it's, you know, it's not a political issue. And I'm not going to bang people over the head with it, but you know, it's, for me, it's, I think we'll get used to those kinds of things. And so that, but between now and then, I don't know, it's anybody's guess, right?
All right, we got a question in the chat from Timothy Kurt. It says, do you think viral surveillance in wildlife has the potential to identify or prevent the next pandemic? Or is spillover inevitable to some extent given viral evolution and species interactions?
I've always been skeptical of screening wildlife for viruses and so on. I think it's useful to know what's out there. I worry that we start targeting certain animals, given the history of how we've, you know, or bats are carrying rabies in Latin America, so they were blowing up bat caves all over Latin America for a while. I worry about that. I guess I'm more, I would more identify with that indigenous approach of saying it's more about land use and habitat conservation than it is about specific species. I think it's useful to know more or less what's out there, and you know, Barry could comment on this better than I can, but viruses are, most viruses are not that stable, and they can evolve faster than we can ever evolve. Bacteria will, you know, they exchange, they don't have moral qualms about exchanging genetic information the way people do, right? They'll just exchange bodily fluids. Great, let's do it. You know, so they spread, you know, you have plasmids without borders, if you want, going all over the world. So it's useful. But that's the bigger answers are going to be, how do we interact with habitats with other species? How do we maintain wildlife habitats in urban areas? How do we foster certain kind of species and other species? These are kind of larger policy questions. And I think in the long term, as a species, as Homo sapiens, that's where the big answers are going to be. In the medium term, being able to identify these things, that's where the vaccine people come in and so on. That's great. I'm all for it. And if I look at my grandchildren or other people's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, say, what kind of a world do they want to grow up in? It's not going to be just this identifying which viruses are out there. It's going to be, how can we create living and eating spaces that are more sustainable?
I'm going to throw in a question there really quickly. We have a few more minutes. A lot of us have been discussing One Health and how to get that collaboration going. Everyone talks about collaborating and working together, but in the end, people are, I'm summarizing, but a lot of people are just interested in their first author publication, getting that Nature publication, and less worried about being part of a team. Are there any academic institutions that you found have been successful in promoting that and getting people excited to be part of a team?
Yeah, there are a range of issues there. I mean, one of them has to do with the way academia rewards publication and so on. And one of the things, Barry asked me why I'd retired. Well, I took early retirement partly so I wouldn't have to worry about my CV and tenure and promotion committees and all that kind of. I can just follow up on my curiosity and look at the best evidence and follow through on that. In the 1990s, early 1990s, we had, surprise, surprise, we had a conservative government that promoted interdisciplinary work, and it was sort of accidental. It was in the lead up to the Rio Convention. What was that, 92? And in 1992, the Convention on Biodiversity. And we had a government led by Brian Mulroney, who was a friend of Ronald Reagan's, and he wanted to promote something. And we have something in Canada called the International Development Research Center. And he decided to make that a flagship for interdisciplinary research. So they did they funded a lot of interdisciplinary work, almost all internationally, because that's been their focus. The other thing that happened was we had a minister of the environment, Lucien Bouchard, who was from Quebec, who was actually a separatist, which is kind of weird also. This is Canadian politics, who was a really good minister of the environment. And he said, I'm going to give a big pot of money, millions of dollars, which in Canada at that time was a lot of research money. And I'm going to give it jointly to what we then were the three granting councils: Medical Research Council, Social Sciences and Humanities, Natural Sciences and Engineering. They will have a joint fund. They will have to administer it jointly, and people will apply, and you will have to have a project which is interdisciplinary. It has to be, or you're not going to get the money. So it turns out we got a pot of money for studying something called agroecosystem health, which we didn't know what it was at the time, but it was basically One Health applied to agricultural areas. When the money came into the university wanted to distribute it to the different departments where there were students and faculty. And I said, no, we want to have a dedicated spot for this project, a whole floor on a building. And they went back and forth. I said, if you don't do that, I've looked at the research on how this kind of research works. I'll send it back. I'll send the money back. And so then they took my bluff, because the university always wants money coming in. And we got a space. So we had veterinarians, social scientists, economists, plant biologists, entomologists. All the grad students were in one space. They had little carrels, basically an open space office. So a lot of the interchange took place during coffee breaks. I'm working on this part of it. So there were two lessons that I took away from that. One is that the grad students who are working on this and the postdocs need to be in a common space. The second is that it works best if you're working on a common problem, because One Health in general just goes off in all directions. If you say, let's look at One Health in some part of Eastern Tennessee, let's look at, here's a boundary, and let's bring together all the people we need to look at that and get the grad students and get the postdocs and get the faculty working together on that space, on that, applying One Health there. And to me, that combination seemed to work the best. And it has been a really hard sell in universities, because universities develop on a disciplinary basis, right? And it's not going to be everybody. There are going to be some postdocs and grad students and faculty that are really keen on it, and some are going to focus on the lab work that they're doing. That's fine. It's not, you don't want everybody there. You just want people that are keen to do it. So trying to make those institutional changes it's a hard sell, and they often respond to money, being universities. So you have to convince somebody, like in Canada, it was this Minister of Environment said, I'm going to give you a lot of money if you do this. Find a benefactor, private, public, Gates Foundation, doesn't matter. Somebody who says, we're going to give you this money if you all work together and focus on this issue. To me, that's the way to go.
Well, yeah, I think you're kind of echoing some things we're trying to do here at UT. So maybe we'll convince some folks. I really appreciate it. And it's 1 o'clock now. So we really appreciate your time. You know, any questions, you can throw them to the One Health email. We could try to get them to Dr. Waltner-Toews or anything like that. Again,
it's great.
Thank you so much for talking. This was great. And we hope to keep in touch. So.
Okay, keep at it. You're the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.